The holidays are a time for celebration, a time when family and friends come together to bask in each other's company around the fire. But for a family back in 1945, the events that unfolded on Christmas Eve proved to be anything but merry. Join me in this Christmas mystery as we investigate what really happened to the Sodder children. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, and happy holidays to you all. As always, I'm your host Jordan Hopkins, and thank you for joining me today. It was December of 1945, and the citizens of West Virginia were excited. Why, you might ask? Because World War II had just ended 4 months prior, and everyone was eager to gain a sense of normalcy and recover from a time of incredible hardship. Though for a family living in the small town of Fayetteville, their quality time spent around the crackling fire would quickly explode into an event none of them would ever forget. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve, when George and Jenny Sodder, along with 9 of their 10 children, were celebrating the holiday by relaxing in their living room, sharing stories, and innocently wondering what hidden treasures awaited them under the tree. Nearly everything was perfect. They had full stomachs from the hearty meal Jenny had prepared that evening, the fireplace was lit and providing the family with ample protection from the bitter snow outside, and everyone was in good spirits thanks to the end of the war. The only thing that was missing was the second eldest son, 21-year-old Joseph, who was away serving in the army at the time. With 9 mouths to feed, one might think the Sodders were struggling to provide for their family. But the reality was, despite George and Jenny immigrating from Italy while they were both quite young, they found themselves in the upper middle class of society, after George had successfully begun his own trucking company, which propelled the family into being one of the more respected members of their community. With the money George had earned from his trucking business, the young family was able to settle 2 miles outside of town, where they constructed a 2-story farmhouse where they would raise their children in. Everything was perfect. And on that late Christmas Eve of 1945, George and Jenny were happy. As the evening was drawing to a close, the Sodder's eldest daughter, 17-year-old Marion, came walking through the front door, kicking her frozen boots off and shaking the snow off her shoulders. She had just finished working a shift at the local general store and came bearing presents for her younger sisters. 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny, and 6-year-old Betty were ecstatic to finally have their big sister home for Christmas, and better yet, she came with toys. The 3 young girls begged their mother to allow them to stay up past their scheduled bedtimes, to which she eventually relented and agreed, provided so long as 2 of her boys, 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis, had finished their daily farm chores for the evening. By this time, George, along with the oldest son, 23-year-old John, and his third oldest, 16-year-old George Jr., had all retired for the evening after having spent a long day working together. This then left Jenny to care for the remaining children, but seeing as Maurice and Louis were busy finishing up their final chores for the night, and the 4 girls were occupied in the living room playing with their new toys, she excused herself to put her youngest, 3-year-old Sylvia, to bed. After putting Sylvia down for the night, and finding Maurice and Louis had come inside and they themselves were getting ready for bed, Jenny came downstairs to find the 4 girls still gleefully playing with one another. She couldn't help herself from allowing her smile to cross her face at the sight of her 4 young girls getting along with one another, but it was getting late. She instructed Marion to keep the noise at a minimum and to make sure the other 3 went to bed soon. She then excused herself one last time and climbed the wooden staircase to her bedroom to join her husband for a night of peaceful sleep. In the early hours of Christmas Day, roughly around 12:30 in the morning, the phone on the main floor began to ring, waking Jenny from her dreams. In her tired and groggy state, she quickly sprang from her bed and quickly shuffled down the staircase to silence the phone from waking anyone else up in the house, and to find out who could have possibly have been calling at this ungodly hour. When she picked up the receiver and held it to her ear, she was met with the sound of laughter and the clinking of what sounded like wine or champagne glasses in the background. A woman whose voice she didn't recognize asked for a name belonging to somebody she didn't know. Thinking to herself if the clinking of glasses was any clue, this cackling woman must have dialed the wrong number by mistake in her inebriated state. After politely informing the lady on the other end of the line that she had gotten the wrong number, the response the mysterious lady gave was what Jenny would later call was a weird laugh. And before anything else was said, the caller on the other end abruptly hung up the phone, leaving Jenny puzzled, but more so just annoyed at what seemed to be a drunken disturbance. Before going back off to bed, Jenny noticed something strange. While she was standing by the phone, she realized the lights were left on, the front door was then also unlocked, and the blinds were left open. Now this was something that kind of caught her off guard. Usually if one of the children were to stay up late, it was these little details that would be their job in doing before finally heading off to sleep in the attic where most of them slept. But as Jenny was making her rounds, ensuring that all was properly cared for, she found Marion fast asleep on the couch, and the other 3 girls were nowhere in sight. Thinking perhaps the other 3 had all gone off to sleep, forgetting their chores in the excitement of the coming Christmas morning, and Marion having collapsed on the couch out of exhaustion from work and looking after her siblings, Jenny decided to let it go and let the children rest. Closing the last of the blinds, Jenny ascended the creaking wooden stairs that led to her bedroom and settled back down into her warm bed next to George, ready to get back to her night of sleep. Though it wasn't to last. Just as she was settling in and was slowly drifting back off to sleep, at around 1 in the morning, she was awoken suddenly by something loud landing on the roof. And no, it wasn't Santa Claus. She would later describe the sound being like that of a large solid ball slamming against the shingles of the house, then rolling down off the side and hitting the snow-covered ground. She jolted right up in bed, wondering what could have caused the sudden disturbance, and waited in anticipation for any sign of another noise. But after seconds had turned into minutes, she tiredly fell backwards into her place on the bed and finally was able to peacefully close her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Another half hour passed when Jenny was awoken once more by something drifting slowly into her room. The telltale sign of smoke, sneaking its way into the bedroom, instantly sprung Jenny into action. Violently pushing off the blankets and scrambling out of bed, she quickly shuffled into the hallway and followed the trail of smoke over to the room her husband used for an office. She quickly flung open the door to peer inside, but was instantly met with a cloud of obnoxious smoke, choking and repelling her backwards into the hallway. Panicked, she rushed back to her bedroom and woke a tired and quite confused George, who tried to make sense of the hysteria his wife was in. Piecing together the panicked ramblings and becoming aware of the smoke that was now gathering in the hallway and his bedroom, George swiftly leapt from his bed and rushed to wake his 2 eldest sons, John and George Jr. Jenny quickly followed behind George but quickly grabbed a still sleeping Sylvia on her way out and brought her down the stairs to wake Marion still sleeping on the couch. She instructed her to take Sylvia outside and keep her safe, while she rushed back up to the 2nd floor and began screaming for her other 5 children still sleeping in the attic. When she returned up the stairs, she found George attempting to deal with the fire quickly diminishing the wooden stairs that led to the attic, and John and George Jr. joined their mother in the shouting and trying to desperately wake even just one of their siblings upstairs. But despite all their effort, they got no response. Marion at this point refused to remain helpless, and abandoned her protective duties, leaving Sylvia in a safe place outside. She rushed back inside to see what more she could do to help, bursting through the front door only to realize the others were already tending to the task of retrieving her siblings in the attic. She then took it upon herself to rush to the phone hanging on the wall and attempted to dial the fire department. But suspiciously, the line wasn't active, meaning she couldn't call for any kind of help at all. The neighbors weren't that far away, so she quickly departed the scene and sprinted over there. But when calling from the neighbor's home, no operator answered the call. Things were beginning to unfold faster than the family realized, and the 4 members upstairs were forced to abandon the second floor after the fire and smoke rapidly spread to all corners of the home. Continuing to shout on their descent down the stairs and waiting as long as they could before the wooden house began to collapse in on itself, a distraught Jenny and George, along with John and George Jr., retreated from their smoldering home, meeting a tearful Marion who had just returned from the neighbors and watched their parents and brothers exit the home without her other siblings. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children managed to escape the inferno that engulfed their home, with the other 5 still nowhere to be found. Not about to give up though, John had made mention that he had climbed up to the attic and jostled the 5 of them awake, and had instructed them to follow him down the stairs where at the time he met his mother and younger brother and began screaming for them to come down with him, though according to him, they never did. John's testimony outside inspired the group to attempt a rescue, and though by this point the main floor, as well as the staircase that led upstairs, was quickly turning to ash, George rushed to the side of the house where a ladder was always kept. His plan was to climb up the side of the house, bust through the glass attic window, and pull all of his children to safety. But when he and his sons arrived on the side of the house, the ladder was mysteriously missing. George then got the idea to jump into one of his trucks and drive it up to the side of the house where he would use that as a way to climb up the side to reach the window. Though despite having worked perfectly fine the previous day, both trucks wouldn't start for some reason. Setback after setback didn't deter George, however, and he attempted one last rescue. He grabbed a barrel of water nearby and was about to throw it onto the flames, but seeing how it was West Virginia on Christmas night, the water in the barrel was frozen solid. The 6 members of the family were helpless as they watched their home be swallowed up entirely by the roaring fire, with the 5 children still missing and trapped inside. In less than an hour, what had once been a home full of joy and warmth was reduced to nothing more than a pile of sorrow and smoldering ash. Piecing together the details of the fire proved to be infuriatingly tedious. It would seem that fate would prove herself to be a fickle mistress. One moment you could be basking in the warmth and love of your family, and a few short hours later, it could come crashing down around you in a blazing inferno. A passing motorist who had been out at the local tavern that night had seen the flames from the road and rushed back to the center of town and attempted to call the fire department from there. But again, just like Marion and her neighbors, they were unsuccessful in getting through to anyone. Thanks to the end of the Second World War coming about just a few short months prior, the Fayetteville Fire Department was comically understaffed. Eventually, when somebody did manage to track down Fire Chief F.J. Morris, he wasn't trained and, in turn, wasn't able to drive the much-needed fire truck and had to wait for someone more qualified to come and drive it. To make matters worse, he was the only one at the station, meaning he had to resort to creating a phone tree, which by principle is a fairly simple way of getting into contact with a whole team. Morris would call one member, informing him on what was happening and where he needed to go, then hang up and call another member. The member who he had just called would then call someone else until it branches out like a tree, until all the firefighters had gotten the message. Like I said, simple concept, but it drastically eats up precious time. Despite the fire hall just being 2.5 miles away, with the fact that it was in the middle of the night and it was Christmas, the team of firefighters didn't arrive on the Sodder farm until 7 hours after the fire had started, driving into the yard a little after 8 in the morning. And by this point, there was very little for them to do. The fire for the past couple hours had begun to put itself out, after consuming the entire house, leaving behind charred timber and falling ashes. Though one thing, or should I say several things, were missing. While doing their inspection on the ruins of what used to be the Sodder home, the firefighters, one of whom was Jenny's brother, struggled to find any bones. Surely, if there were 5 casualties in this house fire, the presence of their remains should have been hiding in the ashes somewhere. But despite their best efforts, no one on scene could locate any. By 10 a.m., Fire Chief Morris solemnly approached George and Jenny and informed the grieving parents their children had perished. Their bones had turned to ash. Unable to pull themselves together, the Sodders were so distraught with grief, the remaining family departed the scene, unable to bear the sight of the charred remains of their house any longer. Despite Morris's urgings to wait for a more thorough investigation to be done by the fire marshal in a few days, George and Jenny couldn't stand to wait and bulldozed the house in just a matter of days, completely leveling out the land, intending for it to become a large garden memorial for their lost children. A few days later after the fire, the local coroner held an inquest and, along with a jury, determined the cause of the accident to be blamed on faulty wiring. On the 30th of December, death certificates for the 5 children were issued, and on the 2nd of January, their funeral would be held. However, only the surviving children would show up. Both George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend. Time would continue to pass by, and the events of that fateful Christmas day would permanently engrave themselves into the minds of all the surviving family members, most of all, George and Jenny. In an attempt to rebuild their lives, the details of that night continued to cross their minds over and over. Something felt wrong to the 2 still grieving parents. There were too many strange things that occurred that night. Too many things conveniently happening that sabotaged any effort in combating the flames or rescuing the children. They carefully went over their own accounts of the night's events. The belief their 5 children had succumbed to the fire seemed less and less obvious. The first thing that occurred to the 2 was the initial cause of the fire was deemed to have been caused by faulty wiring in the house by the officials, meaning the power to the whole house should have been out. But everyone gathered outside that night remembered the outside Christmas lights had all been on and working perfectly fine, as well as the lights on the Christmas tree inside. Then, the day after the fire, while leaving his property with his sons, George had spotted the lost ladder that was always up against the side of the house. The very ladder that would have allowed him access to the attic window was now lying at the bottom of a steep embankment about 75 feet away from the house. And thirdly, after learning Marion had attempted to call for help from the house's phone but found it inoperable, the Sodders had a telephone repairman come out and investigate why. During what would turn into a quick investigation, the repairman informed George and Jenny that after climbing up the 14-foot tall telephone pole, he found the line had been cleanly cut by something sharp. It was as if someone had put in the effort to climb all the way up, reach out an extra 2 feet on the line, and cut the wires with pliers. With all of this adding up, it made George even more suspicious about his trucks failing when he needed them most that night. He was diligent in ensuring his trucks ran properly and were well taken care of. They were, after all, his means to conduct business and operate his trucking company. For them both to suddenly fail, despite them both running perfectly fine within the last 24 hours, it seemed incredibly unlikely to him. George and Jenny knew there was something else going on, so they began asking questions. Jenny had a suspicion. She wasn't content with Morris's conclusion that all 5 of her children's bones had been completely incinerated by the fire. As she was doing one of her many walkthroughs through the remains of her homes before it was bulldozed, she noticed that there was a lot of household items that had survived the inferno, leading her to think, why would their bodies burn completely, while so many other things in the house survived? Following her hunch, she discovered a newspaper article describing a similar fire which decimated an entire family of 7, all of whom had their skeletal remains found and recovered afterwards. So she got into contact with an employee from the local crematorium and inquired how hot it would actually take for the bones of a human to eventually turn into ash. They told her that it would take upwards to 2 hours at a constant temperature of over 1,000 degrees Celsius, or 2,000 Fahrenheit. This was a disturbing fact to hear for Jenny. On a cold December night, the fire had only burned for less than an hour before it began to die out on its own, and it had been nowhere near hot enough to have burned her children's bones down into piles of ashes. Something was very wrong here. Fire Chief Morris assured both her and George after a thorough search the bones of their children weren't there and had most likely been turned to ash. But according to the employee at the crematorium, this was impossible. The more and more the two looked into it, the more the Sodders found the authorities' explanation to be less than believable, and the idea that their 5 children had died in the fire that night became less and less likely every day. Finally, a spark of hope came when the police arrested a man who visited the Sodder farmhouse in the cover of darkness just a few nights before the fire occurred. Apparently, he had paid a visit to the farm in hopes of stealing some valuables, but was only to make off with the block and tackle George used to remove and install vehicle motors or to lift bales of hay with. While in police custody, the thief admitted to having cut the phone line, but said he had believed it to be the power line. While he admitted he was guilty of cutting the line, he insisted he played no role in starting the fire. Frustratingly, the police either neglected to record or ask why he specifically wanted to steal from the Sodders, and even more so, they failed to secure proper documentation on the identity of the thief, leaving George and Jenny Sodder with more questions than answers. The passing winter months were cold and bitter for the remaining members of the family. Slowly but surely, as winter passed by and the spring thaw began to melt away the frost, moving on from the events of that dark Christmas night was a task that was slowly getting easier with each day gone by. Easier for everyone, except for George and Jenny. They still held out hope that their children hadn't perished that cold December night and had somehow escaped. But if they did, where were they? Not long after the frost allowed, the Sodders, as they said they would, seeded the first flowers over top of their bulldozed homestead, the beginning of the memorial garden Jenny would tend to for the rest of her life. But not long after the spring had come, both George and Jenny would receive some disturbing news that would feed their suspicions. During that fateful night a few months back, a bus driver passing through Fayetteville late that Christmas Eve noticed from the road a group of dark silhouettes out near where the farmhouse had been, and what he described were throwing balls of fire at the house. Perhaps he didn't think very much of it, seeing how it was Christmas Eve and just a couple months after the war. He may have just believed the family were celebrating and firing off some fireworks. Nonetheless, the bus driver's testimony, along with all the other mysterious circumstances surrounding the night, didn't help put the Sodders' minds at ease. But there was still a chance the driver's claim was false. George and Jenny hoped he was mistaken. If what he told them was the truth, it would turn this whole mystery into something else. It was only a few short days later when Jenny learned the truth. While she was tending to the garden, Sylvia, who she had brought along with her to help, had wandered off and found herself exploring the thick bushes that outlined the edge of where the house used to stand. It's here the young girl would discover the source of what Jenny had believed to be the loud thud hitting the roof, then rolling down off the shingles and hitting the ground outside that night. Spotting the round object hiding in the bushes, the small girl reached down and picked it up out of the dirt and ran off to show her mother her find. Jenny was shocked at her discovery and quickly showed it to her husband. He did a quick examination of the object and, to his horror, found his youngest daughter had discovered a pineapple bomb, a small handheld grenade used in the war. This discovery sent the Sodder parents down a spiral of conspiracies and paranoia. With this find, they were certain the past discoveries and coincidences were all connected in some way, and the events of that Christmas Eve had been maliciously planned by someone out to get them. But who? Who would have gone so far as to burn down the Sodder homestead, attempting to kill half of the family, and then what the Sodders believed to possibly kidnap their lost 5 children. The theory developing in the Sodders' minds then led them back to the war. West Virginia was chock full of Italian immigrants, just like George and Jenny once were. But unlike the Sodders, there were many of these immigrants who supported the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. George, to say the least, was very outspoken in his disapproval of Mussolini's leadership and publicly criticized his actions. And this not only sparked many heated arguments with Mussolini loyalists, but also earned George quite a few enemies. In later October, before the fire occurred, a local insurance salesman knocked on the Sodders' front door, trying to sell George some life insurance. When George turned him down, the salesman, almost as if a switch had been flipped in him, ominously warned George his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed, as punishment for the dirty remarks he had made against Mussolini. At the time, George probably didn't think very much of this. It was more than likely just an empty threat by a man with different political ideals. But a few weeks after that, another man came to the Sodder farmhouse in search of work. While he was there, he had made remarks to George that a couple of fuse boxes at the back of the house would probably cause a fire someday. This confused George quite a bit because just a few days prior to this man's visit, he had an electric stove installed in the house, and the electric company had assured him the wiring was all up to code. Still though, with the warning from the insurance salesman and this warning from the stranger looking for work, George contacted the electrical company and had them come out to do another inspection just in case. When they came back, they again assured George there was nothing wrong with the wiring and nothing to fear. Then following up to Christmas Eve, both John and George Jr., the 2 eldest sons living at the farm, claimed to have noticed multiple figures sitting in a black car watching the house. They would wait on the road and show up almost every day for a week at the same time when the Sodders' younger children would return home from school. With all these different threads all coming together, George and Jenny were convinced their children didn't perish in the fire like the officials claimed. They firmly believed Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were all still alive and had been kidnapped in a scheme that seemed to go deeper and deeper the more they learned. And they didn't hide this. They wanted everyone to know they believed their children were still out there, in hopes someone would come forth with information regarding their whereabouts. Of course, as time went by, the Sodders did indeed receive several reports that their children were still out there, somewhere. On the night of the fire, a woman who had been just down the road claimed to have witnessed a car speeding away from the scene, and although it was dark outside, she thought she may have noticed 5 young children all huddled in the back seats. Another woman running a tourist shop about 50 miles west of Fayetteville claimed to have interacted with all 5 of the children when they entered her shop the day after the fire, and even had served them all a Christmas Day breakfast. Then yet another woman by the name of Ida Crutchfield, who managed a hotel 3 hours away in Charleston, believed she had spotted the 5 Sodder children when they came into her hotel about a week after the fire. In her statement, she said she didn't remember the exact date, but remembered they walked through the front doors of the lobby at around midnight, accompanied by 4 adults, 2 men and 2 women. From what she could tell, they all looked to be of Italian descent, but when she approached to talk to the children, one of the men with them stared at her with hostility in his eyes, and before she could get another word in, the man spun around and rapidly said something in Italian, causing all the children to immediately go quiet. Within just a few hours of staying there, the entire party checked out of the hotel at the first sign of dawn. George would personally follow up on any small rumor that his lost children were spotted, even so far as going all the way down to Texas 22 years after the fire to investigate a letter a woman had written and sent to them saying a man named Louis had admitted to her who he really was and his past after a night of heavy drinking. But unfortunately, like with every trail, it would run cold. With assistance from his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, and the Houston Police Department, George was able to track down the man who claimed to have been Louis, but after being found, he retracted his claim and told him he was not his missing son. According to Paxton, the legitimacy of this claim lingered in the mind of George for the rest of his life. Being so hopeful he had finally found one of his lost children, George was heartbroken when he was told he had the wrong man, and after every lead he ever had would lead him nowhere. The Sodders never stopped searching. Not long after they came to the conclusion the fire was merely a distraction for the crime of abducting their children, George and Jenny erected a large billboard along the highway near where their old farmhouse once stood, with pictures and descriptions of their lost children, pleading for their safe return. They also offered a reward of $5,000 to anyone who could help them. Then later, they doubled the reward to a staggering $10,000. Adjusting for inflation, that comes to around $150,000 in today's money. They were desperate. They wanted their children home with them, safe. So in 1947, George and Jenny sent a letter about their tragic case to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. They eventually received a reply from J. Edgar Hoover himself saying, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." And although he wouldn't personally involve himself in this matter, he did make several of his agents available to assist in the investigation at the discretion of the local authorities. The local fire and police departments, however, were adamant that they did not want the FBI's help and refused their involvement in the case. Upon discovering the FBI were turned down by the Fayetteville authorities, the Sodders then hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. He wouldn't find too much, but did manage to find out that during the inquest to determine the official cause of the fire, which remember was deemed to be faulty wiring, then also to issue the death certificates for the 5 children, it just so happened that the pushy salesman with the ominous prophecy the house would burn down due to George's outspokenness towards Mussolini was head of the jury who came to this conclusion. Tinsley also managed to uncover a strange story surrounding Fire Chief Morris. While Morris claimed to have found no remains on the site, Tinsley was able to discover he had lied, and that he had indeed found something in the smoldering ashes that Christmas morning. Apparently, confessing to the local minister, he had told him that he did find a small human heart on the scene, but for some reason, he buried it in a small box right on the property. Hearing this news, the Sodders were furious, and along with Tinsley, they confronted and demanded Morris dig up the location where he had buried the heart. Morris complied with their request and took them to the exact spot where he had buried it, and uncovered the box with the small charred heart still inside. George and Jenny then took the heart to the local funeral director and had him examine the heart in hopes he would be able to tell them the age of the owner, so they could get an idea of whose it might have belonged to. Interestingly though, the funeral director informed them what they had wasn't a human heart, but rather was just a blackened piece of cow liver. Turning back to Morris to explain himself, he then admitted he had fabricated the whole story of finding the heart and planting the box and liver in hopes the Sodders would drop their investigation and accept the fact that their children were killed that day. He had grown tired with the constant questioning and had just wanted to put the whole case to bed. In reality, his attempt in silencing the Sodders proved to have the opposite effect. The attempted trick just made them angry and strengthened their resolve in finding their lost children. They handed out flyers and pictures of their lost children to strangers on the street, asking if they had been seen, and they even traveled to neighboring towns and cities to hang up the flyers in hopes someone would give them some answers they were desperately seeking. But nothing came of any of it. In all of their searching, investigating, and pleading, they didn't come close to finding where their lost children were taken to. But in August of 1949, they got an idea. Thanks to the cruel trick the fire chief had pulled on them, they thought, because maybe they had bulldozed the remains of the house just a few days after the fire, before a more thorough investigation could be done, perhaps there was a chance the bones of their children were missed, and were actually buried under the memorial garden they had planted. So, using their connections and wealth, they hired a pathologist from Washington, D.C. to come out to oversee and conduct a thorough excavation of the property. Aside from finding some small coins and pieces of metal, yet another twist was added to the story when the pathologist uncovered 4 shards of vertebrae in the dirt. In a burst of excitement to possibly figuring out the mystery, they sent the pieces of vertebrae to the Smithsonian Institute back in Washington for analysis, and the scientists there studying them concluded they had belonged to a teenage boy. But the thing was, the bones showed no sign of ever being exposed to fire, and the bones had belonged to someone aged 17 or older. Seeing how Maurice was the oldest missing child at 14 years old, these bones couldn't have been his. So the excavation of the site continued, but no further discovery of bones were found. It was believed the 4 shards of vertebrae found deep in the earth must had already been in the dirt that was moved onto the property to bury the remains of the house when it was bulldozed. Though some suspected, perhaps the bones found there were purposefully planted in order to fool the Sodders into thinking their children had indeed died there and would stop searching for them. But whichever theory you want to believe, it would never stop the Sodders in their quest for the truth. Over 20 years after the fire, Jenny had gone out to receive some mail that was addressed only to her. When she opened the envelope, inside was a solitary picture of a young man, one who was obviously in his late 20s or early 30s. Confused, she searched the envelope and found nothing else inside, but quickly discovered on the back of the photo were a few cryptic words. Written in handwriting, it said, "Louis Sodder," but below that something else was written that made very little sense to George and Jenny. It said, "I love Brother Frankie," and it also included ILIL boys.A90132 or 35. The two were convinced this was their lost son Louis, but as the envelope was postmarked as being sent from Kentucky, it offered them no return address to send a reply to or to visit. Studying the picture of the young man, the similarities were strikingly similar to what they believed their young son would have grown up looking like, and thinking it over for a while, they made the decision to withhold publicizing the photo or the news of it being sent to them, thinking perhaps it would be best to avoid getting Louis into any trouble just in case. But even after keeping this information to themselves, they never heard from Louis again. The only clue one of their lost children had survived was this small, lonely photograph, which they cherished forever and framed above their fireplace. George Sodder would pass away in 1968, not long after they received the picture in the mail, and Jenny retreated from the rest of the world, remaining in constant mourning. She erected a large fence around her property and continued to use her remaining wealth to build up her home. Room after room and layer after layer protected her inside as she built up as many barriers as she could to separate herself from the rest of the world. From the day after the fire, all the way to her death in 1989, she exclusively wore black as a sign of mourning for her lost children. Both her and her husband would never find the peace they so desperately searched for, both dying with broken hearts without ever knowing the true fate of their lost children. But just because they were gone, it didn't mean the investigation stopped. Picking up where their parents left off, the remaining Sodder children held out hope their brothers and sisters were still out there somewhere, and believed attempts to find or reach out to them should be taken. All except John, the eldest, the one who claimed to have shaken his siblings in the attic awake, but would later change his story, saying he simply had just called up to them. He never really spoke about that night ever again, and even going so far as to trying to convince his siblings that the events of that night were behind them, and they should all just move on. But despite their hopes in finding their lost siblings, one by one, the remaining 5 Sodder children slowly passed away, leaving the youngest, Sylvia, as the last surviving member of the family to have been there that night. She would often reminisce about those long nights she spent by the fireplace with her father, trying to piece together the clues, coincidences, and facts of that fateful Christmas. But even after picking up where her parents left off, she was unable to figure out the whereabouts of her lost brothers and sisters. At the age of 79 years old, Sylvia Paxton, the last surviving member of the Sodder family, had finally rejoined her family and peacefully passed away in April of this very year. Despite all members of the family who were there that night now being gone, their ordeal and their perseverance will never be forgotten. But just as they were, we are still left wondering, what happened to those 5 kids? Theories on what had occurred that Christmas Eve continue to pop up from time to time, but with no real evidence to support them, most just remain as lingering thoughts and ideas. Others have pointed out we know very little about George's life back in Italy before he immigrated, and suspected perhaps even the Italian mafia had somehow been involved with the kidnapping after trying to extort money out of him, only to steal his children away after he refused to pay. There are those who believe even a relative had appeared on the Sodder farmhouse and snuck in through the unlocked door. They then climbed up to the attic to inform the children the house was on fire, and they would surely die if they didn't follow them outside. They then drove off with the children, claiming they would take them somewhere safe, and then lying to them after saying their parents and other siblings didn't make it out in time. Whatever you choose to believe, we all have to admit the circumstances and coincidences surrounding that night are very suspicious and do seem to point to the idea the 5 children were taken from their home and family that Christmas. But the alternative is no more less tragic. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty had either burned to death in their family home, or they were taken, never to see their family again. The events of that Christmas Eve ripped an entire family apart. Determination bordering on obsession to find their lost children and siblings, the remaining members of the Sodder family tirelessly searched for decades to no avail, never getting the peace of mind they all so desperately needed. Nearing his death, George was quoted in an interview pleading, "We only want to know. If they really did die in the fire, we need to be convinced. Otherwise, we need to know what happened to them." Up until each of their deaths, they searched for a truth that may or may not have even existed. And to this day, their story will likely never be solved. Thank you for listening to the incredibly mysterious case of the missing Sodder children. And while it is quite the depressing story, we can still be hopeful that the whole family has been reunited in the afterlife somewhere. But that belief is up to you. As for myself, I do believe there were just too many small details, strange coincidences, and odd discoveries that support the idea that the children were taken, and didn't succumb to the fire like people wanted George and Jenny to believe. That being said though, there really is no hard evidence to support this. It's simply just impossible to say what the exact fate of the children were. But then again, in my opinion, that's what makes the best mysteries, the ones that can't be solved. If you enjoyed this episode and are wanting to hear more, be sure to subscribe or follow to the show on whatever app you're listening on, and please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It only takes a second and helps the podcast a great deal. You can contact me via Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast, where I'll post pictures of the episodes I talk about on here, and where I'll also post the reward poster for the 5 missing Sodder children so you can get a good look at them. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to recognize your grandparents among the 5 and be able to solve this mystery for the world. You can also email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com, where you can write me about any strange stories you have about the paranormal or the supernatural. Who knows, maybe your story will make an appearance on the show someday. As it is the holiday season, the best gift you could give me is sharing the show with your friends and family. On those long commutes to and from relatives or friends' homes, this show could provide a source of entertainment for your loved ones while they drive to visit you. But as always, thank you so much for listening. Your support means so much to me. So please take care of yourselves during this busy season, and I hope you all have a better Christmas than the Sodder family had all those years ago. So happy holidays, and I'll see you in the new year. Thanks for listening.